Well, hello there again, friends. Today is 3/28/2022, and today is the Odin Project Vlog Day 81. And today I am 82% complete with the intermediate HTML and CSS course, or section if you will. And I am down here in the grid modules, and that's where we're going to get started. So I completed Introduction to Grid, creating a grid, and then 3/4 of the position grid elements. We'll go through it, but there's an exercise at the end that I didn't get to that I'll get to in the next video. But everything grid today, so it's quite the rabbit hole. Lots to know, and they aren't shy about letting you know up front that there's no need to memorize this stuff, but just get a good understanding for how things work. So just like everything else. So with that said, let's get started. So they start with an intro. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. It's not a rabbit hole yet. This is just kind of telling you the over like 30,000 foot answer of the difference between Flexbox and Flex and how it's different than Grid and how it's similar, but mostly focusing on the differences. What is a grid? And then there's is there homework in this one? No, not this one. The next section they talk about, or next homework assignment module, they talk about the history of how Flex got started, or not, excuse me, how Grid got started. And so we'll just quickly go through the knowledge check here. It's just a lot of reading here. There's some basic understanding of what a grid looks like, going over an old example of that we did a project for card layout that was frustrating. But yeah, just basic stuff of how grid looks. It's nothing too deep yet, and there's no exercises here. First question is, how can you use Flex to make two-dimensional layout? And basically that's just using two axes, main and cross, to set up your alignment. You can grow, shrink, or change. It's just what we've already been doing, Flex. So it's not really a grid question, but we've been doing that all along, so it's kind of a weird question actually. Second question, why was CSS Grid introduced? And this goes into a little bit of the history, fun fact stuff. I'll let you read it, but basically, in a very big nutshell, there was this Dr. Bert Bose had a interesting concept of viewing layouts in 1996. He seen Flex. It wasn't called he want to say Flex. Sorry, it wasn't. He didn't know it was called Grid back then, but he was reading like newspapers and stuff like that, and they used grid layouts, in magazines and newspapers and all that stuff. And he's like, he had a thought like, well, why can't I apply this to HTML pages? So that was born in 1996 and was adopted in all major browsers in 2017. So Grid was born. This is the short and sweet to that. Which CSS layout module would you use to easily make equal-sized items in a container? So, equal-sized container. Oh yeah, here's the story of the CSS Grid, but basically use gap. You'll use gap property, which will be covered more in the next lesson, but basically gap works exactly the same way as it works in Flex. CSS gap is simply just the space in between the row and the column of each. Sorry, I forgot to mute my phone. It's distracting. There we go. It's muted. Sorry about that. Anyway, CSS Grid for gap, just that horizontal and vertical spacing, and that's that. So next lesson is creating a grid. So this goes into a lot more, get a little more Alice in the rabbit hole type situation here. Start you off slow, setting up your first grid. I kind of they kind of teased about you following along and coding along instead of just reading. So I went ahead and did a little bit in the VS Code. So what I did was I created an index file. Here's a boilerplate, and they have you create a div container with 4 child divs inside of it, and then they have you create the style sheet. And then so here's your basic structure for your HTML, and then to style it, the container is display grid. That's how you activate the grid. Tell the browser you want to use a grid, and then your basic setup for containers is you have grid template columns and grid template rows that you apply at the container level. The difference between one of the many differences, but one of the ones you've learned quickly, as I learned anyway, excuse me, is that in grid, almost all of your grid properties go at the container level, and they flow down to your child. Not, they don't go to children, but just your first child elements. So basically, we're creating a grid template column of 50 pixel by 50 pixels. It just means we're going to have 2 columns, and they're 50 pixels wide each, and we're going to have 2 rows that are 50 pixels wide each. So we're going to have basically a 2 by 2, and then there's a gap of 10 pixels that I created through exercise that creates 10 pixels of gap in between each grid column and row. And then here is just an example of we're targeting the child divs, and we're just creating a border, a blue border, so that we can see what it's doing in the browser. They show you how to do this in DevTools as well, but just so you can see, here's what that ends up looking like. So you got your 10 pixels of gap in between. There's your row. There's your column. And then your item 1, item 2, item 3, item 4, and see it's a 2 by 2. Nice there. Easy to understand, and that kind of gets you started down here. Goes through that, and they're just saying here this is not a grid item because children from your container div, like say your grid is established in container. That means the child divs are the grid items, except for this one because it's a child of another div. So it is not. Unlike in Flex, it would be or could be a direct descendant and have properties assigned to it from Flex. So I'm going to skip over a lot of this. Because I kind of just cursory went over it already, and I want to get to the knowledge check and move on to the last section. The third section is very much a Alice in the rabbit hole situation, but I didn't want to make this video too long either. So first question is, how does an HTML element become a grid item? So that's just simply commanding the display grid here. We'll change that to a grid. What is the space between lines on the grid? That is the... Why did it go to the same spot? What is the space between lines? That's the gap. It's hyperlinked to the wrong area. And you can do grid, display inline grid, which does, a little bit different. Inline grid doesn't do the whole block of the viewport. It just does the I don't know if it'll do it right here. Yeah, it doesn't do anything. Anyway, they talk about inline grid later in the discussion, but basically you do the gap. To answer the question, the gap is what you set for, we already talked about, is getting the space in between the lines. How do you set gutters, also known as alleys, in the grid? So that's using the column gap, row gap properties. And there's an example here that's talking about that. So you have grid template columns 50 pixels by 50 pixels, and grid template row 50 by well, not by 50, but 50 and 50. So that creates that. This is the exact same code actually that I had on the terminal, um, or the editor screen. So, but yeah, the grid gaps will, when you add those in, which are not in here, but when you add those in, that's when you get the. There you go. There's your column gap, and so that creates that gap right there, and that's how you get that. That's how you create that gutter, and those are just called gutters or alleys. It's kind of silly, I think, my opinion, but just call it gap. But describe what happens when you have more content than defined tracks. So they have explicit versus implicit grid. So explicit grid, the simple way to describe this is the explicit is make sure I say I don't want to say this wrong. Explicit is what you type. So so explicit grid is like going in here and creating grid item here. So, and then these are all examples of explicit because I told the browser that I wanted a 2x2 and I have 4 items. So here's how it would become a implicit. So if I added another div and called that item 5 and saved it, and now we go back out, see how it added it down here. It's outside of my 2x2, and so this would be called an explicit because the browser and the flex or the grid. Sorry if I keep saying flexbox. Grid will automatically create that next level item and wrap it down to the next line automatically. And if we zoom in, okay, so Firefox doesn't do this. It talks about in the text that on explicit you'll have dashed instead of a solid line. Oh, that's probably because we've got it. I've got it shown here as a solid line. Let's see if I can. Anyway, it's gonna spend too much time on this. Anyway, behind the solid line, there is probably a dotted line, and that's the. Yeah, you can kind of see it here. See that the dotted line looks different than this dotted line. So this smaller dotted line means that it's explicit, meaning basically the browser is telling me that this was not defined and it was done automatically for me. And that's essentially that. All right. Okay. Come on. How could you change the size of those undefined tracks? So that's using the grid template columns and grid template rows. That's we already went over that, but you can change or add. Like say I wanted to add that third one, I would just simply put another 50 pixel definition after this for well, not for column but for row or column, whatever, and then that would expand it by an additional box, 2 boxes, one each way, and that would satisfy that that requirement, and then those would be explicit. That would turn it to an explicit box, if that makes sense. Explicit cell, excuse me. So that's that in a nutshell. Again, there's a lot I didn't cover. There's a lot of reading here, not a lot of doing, so it's just a lot of cursory information. I encourage you all to read it. So here's positioning grid elements. This is real meaty. So what I'm going to do is, instead of reading through all this, because there's a lot, I'm not going to say I'm sitting here and understanding all of it myself, because I don't, but I do understand a good portion of it. we'll just go through the knowledge check, and then we'll come back in the next video, and because there is a practice exercise down here, going back to the CSS repo we downloaded and cloned down quite a while ago. We're going to do grid layout, and I haven't gotten to that, so we'll do that in the next video. But here we'll just do the knowledge check, explain the difference between a track and a line. So a track is like ABC going across like that, or down. AD would be a track, and a line is what it sounds like, the border. So the border up here would be a line. This would be line 1 for column, or excuse me, row. This would be line 2 for the row. This here would be line 1. Always starts at 1 basically, not 0. So it'd be line 1 for the column, line 2 for the column, line 3 for the column. And so that's that. Without getting into too much detail, just answering the question. What is the smallest unit on a grid? It's a cell. I mentioned that just a moment ago. Didn't spend a lot of detail on it, but the cell is basically the smallest section. So this kitchen would be considered a cell. Bedroom's a cell, bathroom's a cell, closet's a cell, living room's a cell. It's a big cell, but basically it's the individual boxes. What kind of value do we give to the grid column start or grid column end properties? So on these we give them individual values like 1, 2, 3, like you see here, like grid column start, grid column end, because that is, you're telling, and these are applied at the child div level, not at the parent container. It's important. So like living room, for example, is this big one. We're telling it we want a grid column start of 1, which means it's going to start right here at line 1, like I had already mentioned previously, and then we're going to grid column end, as it sounds like, is 6. So we're going to go 6 cells over. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I know that because the lines here, it's kind of cheating a little bit, but I know there's lines, basically transparent lines going up here. If we had this in DevTools and we turned on grid lines, we could see the lines going up in here. But just imagine that they're there. For the sake of brevity for the video, I won't reproduce the grid line there. Which property can we use to combine all the start and end values for the grid item? And that's using grid area. So they have a syntax, a shorthand they're using here. Basically, this first one's your row start, this is your column start, this is your row end, and this is your column end. So if you put them in like that, that's your grid area that that living room's going to sit in. So think of it as like that cell. And what grid container property can map out a visual structure of grid items? So right back to this. So grid area will do that. You can actually, instead of using numbers as far as your lines, you could use a moniker like living room. I know it seems weird. I don't have time in this video to go over it. It's actually talked about pretty extensively here. But basically you can apply that moniker living room, and then you would go down in your code and you'd also add the living room as defined in the grid template area. So you see you have living room, living room, living room, living room, living room. It sounds really repetitive. I don't have time to explain it all here, but that basically replaces the 1, 1, 1, 1 that would be here normally, or in this case, whatever, 50, 50, 50, 50 for the pixels. So you just tell it living room, and so the browser will know that your living room is your grid area that's being applied from the template, and it's going to apply it to living room. So I know that probably doesn't make a lot of sense, but it will when you read through it if you haven't yet. And then you can use last on this part, you can use periods or dots. They use, like down here example, closet, closet, period, period, period. You can use that when you don't have a need yet for defined cells, but you will probably likely in the future. So if you put periods in there, it will kind of save it, so to speak. So it won't. It will basically allow this container to fill out like this, but it won't put the lines in there because you're not telling it anything. You're just reserving it basically, which is pretty cool. So yeah, I went really fast. Feel free to replay this over for further understanding. Thanks for coming along the ride with me today. And I know it might have been a little dry today, a little boring, but real important stuff nonetheless. So I highly encourage you not to skip anything. And like I said at the beginning, tomorrow or the next time I upload, we'll be going into grid layout and talking about that and going over that. So please like, share, and subscribe for more content. And until next time, see ya.